Today on Co-op for Two, a spoiler-free quick before-you-buy-it review for the 4 games in the Cold Case Investigation Unit series. How do these games stack up against the competition? Stay tuned to find out. Let's start with some preliminaries. I'm going to keep this review brief and spoiler-free, deliberately vague, but at the end I will tell you where I think this series fits into the genre and how I would rank these games in terms of personal preference. Now, if you're not familiar with exactly what these games are, sometimes we call these cold case games or mystery suspect games or document dump games. That's because they typically consist of just a collection of sort of randomly ordered documents, police reports, interviews, photographs, crime scene photographs, or items found at the scene of the crime, sometimes cell phone records, etc., stuff like that. And you're usually trying to piece together a crime that has already occurred and figure out which suspect among a bunch of them that you're told about, which one really did it, why, maybe how they did it. Typically, nothing gets destroyed. You would only play these games once, then you understand the story and the mystery, and you could never play them again. But if you take care not to write on them, you could pass them along to someone. I do write on the evidence as I play it. It makes it a little easier, but you don't have to. The documents in these games are the game. That's all you're doing. There's no time limit. Sometimes in some of these games you use the internet. We'll talk about that in this case, but often you're just sitting there pondering the evidence. They can definitely be played solo, but it helps to have multiple minds working on the same thing. Let's get into some details of this particular series now. Okay, let's talk about the games in this series. There are 4 of them as of October 2022. They're all about the same level of difficulty, which I would rate as medium. They're not labeled in terms of difficulty, which is a shame. It's nice when a company can rate the games and maybe has some hard ones and easy ones. I would say these are all about the same. They're all about medium average length for this kind of game. They've all been played live on my YouTube channel where we play the game and then we review it. That would be a good thing to watch after you've played the game yourself. It takes us about 6 hours to play these games on YouTube, talking through them, but in general, it'll probably take you half that if you play this at home yourself, so maybe 2 hours. You could play it with a couple of people. Maybe 2 is the sweet spot, but absolutely soloable. After about 3 or 4, it gets a little difficult. In this genre, some of the companies like to throw in lots of props, like keychains and things you might find at the scene, maybe someone's hat or whatever, complicated extra props that serve no value other than as a sort of novelty factor. Those can be fun when you're playing in a group and the group's like, wow, this is so cool that we've got this thing. It ups the price, but it adds nothing to the actual meat of the mystery. These games eschew that. They're all just paper. All of the documents are paper, but they're of different forms on different stock of different color. And we're going to open one and take a look at it. In fact, let's just do the first case, the diamond heist. I'm going to have to blur all this so you don't see my writing on it. But you would see all this the moment you open it up. You just go through the documents. But let's just walk through this quickly so you see. There's some introduction, a list of contents. That's all good. Something you see not uncommonly in these games, a little page for you to take notes. You can see the sort of structure of these games is to identify the suspects, their motive, their alibi. And then we're going to start going through some that I'll have to blur out. We've got a map here and a list of times on a map, a chart of license plates, security log, emails from people, incident report sheet, some photographs, a little, I would say maybe one of the weaker elements of this series of games, a little notebook from the previous detective, mostly blank. Some notes, some police reports, another photograph, little handwritten cards, notes that were found, some security photo, more documents from different places, a little brochure from a company. Nice quality on that. Other little stationery from different places in different formats. Some more documents. Looks like maybe phone records. A newspaper set in this world. And there you have it. So that gives you some idea of what the documents look like in one of these games. They're all basically of that same format and that same, about the same number of documents in each of those. And I'd call that maybe average to maybe a little bit more than average for this genre in terms of quantity of documents. I'll talk about the quality of the documents a little bit later. Some of them are a little bit amateurish, like that notebook, whereas others go on the other end of the scale and are very believable, like that little brochure. The cost of these games, they're from England, are about £23, about $25, though you can get this on Amazon Prime for $25. There are a variety of cases. There's 2 murder cases, and then a theft, and then something more interesting, a sort of active terrorist threat in case 4. One of the selling points for this game series is that they were designed by a police detective in the UK, Catherine Thompson, and she's got a little bit on the website. Most of the time you would buy this directly from the company. It's a very small company that's just started, but they run sort of team building detective exercises. And one of the blurbs on Amazon is that these stand out because they're designed by a previous actual UK detective. Does that hold up? Is that advertising blurb useful to you? Does it denote something special about these games? Does it show that they were designed by a detective? We'll tackle that coming up soon. Okay, I do want to say something about the use of the internet in this genre and in these cases in particular. It's very common for these games to use the internet at the end to solve the case. For this genre, to ask you to go on the internet to solve the case. Some games ask you specific questions. Some games just say click here for the answer. This game, you do have to go onto the internet to solve the case. The solution is not found within the actual box you get. And I should say, these don't come in a board game box. They come in just a plain envelope which contains these. So you can't really put this on your wall. That's fairly common for these kinds of games, but it's a little sad sometimes when you don't have a memento when you're done with it. But it does cut down on the cost. Okay, so internet. All of these games, you will have to go on the internet to solve them. And there are some hints available on the internet. Different games in this genre make better or worse use of the internet. Some of them, the best of these games, have a very elaborate hint system that's tiered, so you could just get a little bit of a hint, and then if you're really stuck, you get a little bit more and a little bit more. I would say, as a series, these are on the low end of online internet quality experience. So the hint system is particularly bad for this series. It's basically just a random set of 4 hints that you don't even know what hint you're getting. It's just a photograph, you click in a location and it gives you some random hint. You can't say, hey, I'm stuck on this puzzle or this piece, so you have no control over what you're going to get hints on, and it's just 4 little brief ones. So that's particularly bad. It's much nicer when you've got some control and you can just get the little nudge you need. When it comes to solving the cases, they all take, well, I shouldn't say that. 3 of them, the first 3, take a very standard approach of just saying, okay, pick the suspect who did it. Identify the suspect. So you see the list of the 5 suspects. You can click, you can get a little bit more information about a little summary, and then you click it and it'll say, give you a little paragraph about that person and then say, guilty, yes or no. And you're hoping that when you pick the right one, it says, yes, you were right. If you're wrong, it'll tell you a little bit about how you were wrong, and then that's it. The last case, which was designed most recently, is a little more elaborate, a little more satisfying. Now, I can see that Catherine Thompson has started writing epilogues for some of the cases, which is welcome, which is a little extra bit of story that might explain a little bit about what happened to all the players, just to give you a little narrative reward for getting to the end. Remember that a huge part of the enjoyment for playing this kind of game is the story and the narrative. Now, the best games in this genre go much further. In addition to having good hint systems, they actually will walk you through at the end. Like if you get a game from Adventure, one of the probably the top tier of these games, the Adventure series from Germany, it'll walk you through the entire case with multiple pages explaining each piece of evidence, where it fit in, what you might have misunderstood about it, what you might have missed, with photographs showing on which evidence what something was found. So this is not in that caliber. And I have one other substantial complaint about the use of the internet in this series. And in some ways, when we played this series from the first game to the last one, we kind of got the feeling that you could see the writer, the designer, getting better and getting more comfortable with this genre. So you can sort of see the progression as you play. And in the first 2 cases in particular, there's very little use of sort of logic puzzles, but there's some use of cipher puzzles where you've got a cryptic message that you have to decode. That's something quite commonly used in these kinds of games and in the sister genre, which are sort of the puzzle cipher-focused games like the ones from Hunt a Killer and Deadbolt Mystery Society, etc. In those games, you're not really doing psychological deduction and going through evidence as much as you are solving puzzles and ciphers. So it's not uncommon to see them used a little bit in this genre, but in particular, in the first 2 cases of this series, there's a real miss. And that is that there are some ciphers used that you don't you don't find the solution by figuring out, by using your brains and logic to figure out how to decrypt the ciphers. You figure them out by going on the internet and searching, what is this kind of cipher? How does it work? How do I decode it? And then you decode it. So the actual content of the information that you would use to decipher those messages is not contained within the game. And the game tells you, these games are actually advertised as internet is beneficial, but not strictly necessary. And I think probably that's misleading. Probably a better way to say it is you need the internet to solve it, and you need the internet to be able to solve some of the ciphers. You might be able to solve the case without ever deciphering those cryptic messages, those ciphers. But if you're going to decipher them, you are not going to know and not be able to figure out how to decipher them using just the contents of the box. Now, as I said, that seems to happen in the first 2 cases, and then I think the author has gotten some more experience and moved away from that, and it's not true for the second and third case. Okay, let's talk about the quality of the writing and sort of attention to detail and subtlety and humor. That's one of the main things that I look for, and that, to my mind, separates the special games, the high quality games, from the others. To me, it's the quality of and believability of the writing and the evidence, which is not to say always sort of the polish of the documents and the props and the polish of the editorial process, but more sort of what you might call the core skill of the author in writing compelling narrative mystery story dialogue. And for me, that's where these games make it to the sort of special higher quality tier, because the writing here is very high quality. There are quite a few typos. In fact, more typos in this series than maybe any other game in this genre that I've played. This needs a proofreader and editor to go through these, especially given that these were written natively in English. It's not uncommon to find some typos in these kinds of games, but this set has more than most. But the core quality of the writing is the writing that you would get from a real writer. It's engrossing, it's humorous, it's got some very clever little details. The dialogue, and you often get dialogue in these games in the form of interviews and statements and letters and reading cell phone messages that have been intercepted by the cops. Those all feel here very real. And I think that's where the sort of tagline about written by a real detective actually feels right, because there's stuff in here that feels like maybe that you would get from a detective's eye or detective's ear writing this stuff. The dialogue, the interviews, they all feel good. They're all quite compelling. The pacing of stuff in this game, in terms of you never get bored while you're going through these documents and evidence. It all reads as interesting. It all reads as tempting. There's lots of things that you're not sure if it's relevant, if it is. The characters are quite interesting. It's fun to peek behind the curtain and see what their lives are in their phone messages and stuff. There are the newspapers in these games tend to be where things sort of grind to a halt and get boring in lots of these games. Lots of these games make use of a newspaper that's mostly irrelevant, and you're just looking for one or two stories that might be relevant. Yet here, there was some real care put into these newspapers, and so some of the stories are actually quite funny. If you watch our live stream playthrough, you'll see us laughing quite a bit. So yeah, high quality writing, which goes a long way for me in terms of my enjoyment of these games. Let's talk about the core deductive process that you'll be engaged in, the mystery solving here. There is a little bit of cartoonishness in some of the motives and behavior of suspects and the nature of the crimes. That's not uncommon with this kind of game. Some people find that quite upsetting. It takes a little bit of calibration when you play these games to know what to expect. Would this really happen? Would this coincidence be unrealistic enough? Or might that be a possible solution in the case? There's a little bit of that here. And in the very best experience playing these games, sometimes you have these wonderful aha moments where all of a sudden lots of facts that made no sense suddenly click into place. And sometimes you might be chewing for an hour trying to put things into place. I would say this series is not quite in that caliber. There aren't that many huge aha moments. I think where this series really shines, though, is the sort of shoe leather work of chewing through some of the documents in the game. In each of these games, there are some documents that are sort of detail heavy, rich, tabular data, whether it's sort of schedules of appointments or logs in a security system. Each of these games had some really enjoyable, satisfying pieces where we actually went back to and returned back to a piece of evidence over and over again, sort of correlated it with other evidence, tried to match up stuff in documents. And that's where these games shine, maybe better than any game I can remember playing in this genre. For me, the consistent success in all of these games in providing you with dense, fine-grained logs, reports, tables that had tons of information that you had to correlate with other evidence and connect the dots and rule out people by combining multiple evidence and just returning over and over again to a single table, a single security log, whatever. That aspect of these games to me is what made them special and feel real, feel like a real detective spent some real time figuring out how you might solve a difficult case. And lots of little details, some you would miss on your first pass, second pass, third pass through. For me, that's the real enjoyment of these games and really worked well. Very, very enjoyable, makes you feel like a real detective. For me, that's what made this series special, and is a major reason I would recommend them. Okay, before I give you my final thoughts on the series, which you could probably guess basically by now, I do want to give sort of a caveat for people depending on what you want most out of these games. So I think the people that this series might not work for are people who are really sticklers for super believable motive storylines that have low tolerance for sort of cartoonish explanations, and maybe people who are more prone to get upset if the ending isn't wrapped up wonderfully and perfectly and satisfyingly. I think you're going to have more fun with this set if you're the kind of person who really enjoys the ride, the journey, and wants a game where you have lots to talk about and chew over and go through, and is not overly concerned that the end of the case leave them feeling amazing. So balance that. If that's your thing, then you might prefer other games. But if you're good with the journey, this is a nice set to take along with you on that journey. Let me give you my final thoughts on the series, and then at the end, I'll come back and rank them in terms of my subjective opinion. Okay, final thoughts, bottom line, is I absolutely recommend the series, the full series, and they are getting better, and I want to see more. I would happily play more. They're not quite in the highest tier of this genre in terms of production quality, polish, and sort of overall experience. The final solutions leave much to be desired. The website leaves much to be desired, but the writing quality is excellent, and the enjoyment of digging into a single piece of evidence over and over and over again, mining it for details, is some of the best in the genre. And some of the details, some of the fine-grained details, feel more realistic. The individual piece of evidence feels more realistic than many in this game, even if in totality they don't quite meet the very, very best of the games in this genre. But there aren't that many that are in that very, very best. So there's nothing to complain about in playing a game that's in a slightly lower tier. These are still fantastic games and getting better. Okay, let me rank these games now subjectively from my standpoint. But I will say that of all board games, tabletop games, these are the hardest to predict what kind of experience you're going to have. If you come into it a different way, have a different group, get on a different wavelength, you will have a widely varied outcome. So take my subjective rankings with a grain of salt. I would just recommend you play them all. Having said that, I think the first case, case 1, is probably the weakest in terms of the final solution and solving it and coming up with a satisfying ending. And I think I might skip that one in the beginning. If you were just jumping in, I think I'd probably recommend you play 2, 3, and 4. I would start with 2 or 3, maybe. And then if you like it, you can go back and play 1. You'll still enjoy 1, but I would be a little bit worried that case 1 might put a sour taste in your mouth depending on your expectations. From my standpoint, case 3, Who Killed Jenny, was the best, followed by case 4, which felt a little different and experimental. That's called Mission Possible. And then case 2, An Unforeseen Murder. And then at the very end, on the lowest of my rankings, is case 1, The Diamond Heist. They're all enjoyable. They all have their high spots, but I would maybe not start with case 1, just to avoid the potential that it might not quite live up to your expectations. So there you have it, the Cold Case Investigation Unit, designed by a real UK detective, and well worth hunting down and trying.